If you discovered that your child's kindergarten teacher had actually saved hundreds of soldiers' lives as a special forces medic in war zones, would your trust in her increase or would you worry? 3 months ago, the parents at Sunshine Kindergarten thought they knew Maria Santos completely. They were wrong about everything. Welcome to Inspiring Stories. Before we uncover this tale of hidden strength and second chances, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be shared, hit that subscribe button and help us celebrate the extraordinary women hiding in plain sight. The Sunshine Kindergarten sat nestled between oak trees and manicured lawns in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, where soccer moms drove SUVs and fathers discussed mortgage rates at weekend barbecues. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than wildfire, and where Maria Santos had become the subject of whispered conversations among parents who thought they understood her completely. Maria arrived each morning at exactly 7:15, 30 minutes before the children were due to arrive. She unlocked the bright yellow door of classroom B7 with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else in her carefully ordered life. At 42, she moved with a deliberate grace that parents interpreted as shyness, spoke in soft tones they mistook for timidity, and maintained a professional distance they assumed meant she simply wasn't very good with adults. The classroom reflected her personality in ways that no one quite understood. Every crayon was organized by color, every book arranged by reading level, every toy stored in labeled bins that created a sense of order that bordered on military precision. The walls displayed children's artwork with mathematical spacing, and the daily schedule was posted with the kind of detail typically reserved for operational briefings. Parents noticed these things, but interpreted them through the lens of their own assumptions. Maria Santos was the quiet teacher, the one who didn't attend faculty parties, who declined invitations to join them for coffee after drop-off, who seemed more comfortable with 5-year-olds than with the adults who entrusted their children to her care each day. What they didn't notice was how Maria's eyes constantly scanned the classroom, automatically cataloging every potential hazard, every exit route, every position that offered tactical advantage in case of emergency. They didn't see how her hands, when not occupied with finger paints and storybooks, carried themselves with the readiness of someone trained to respond to crisis within seconds. They certainly didn't recognize the way she positioned herself between the children and any potential threat, or how she unconsciously counted heads every few minutes, like someone responsible for keeping a unit alive in hostile territory. The children, however, sensed something different about Miss Maria. They gravitated toward her with an instinct that defied explanation, finding comfort in her presence that went beyond her gentle voice and patient demeanor. When they scraped knees on the playground, she cleaned their wounds with a competence that seemed to exceed typical first aid training. When they had nightmares during nap time, she comforted them with words that carried the weight of someone who understood real fear and had learned to overcome it. But it was the parents who created the problems Maria had been hoping to avoid. They organized themselves into informal committees that evaluated every aspect of their children's education, and Maria Santos had become their latest project for improvement. Jennifer Walsh, a former marketing executive who now channeled her competitive energy into PTA politics, had appointed herself as the unofficial leader of what she called the Classroom Optimization Initiative. During pickup time conversations that Maria could hear through her open classroom door, Jennifer would catalog her concerns about the quiet teacher who didn't seem to understand the importance of parent engagement. "She's perfectly nice," Jennifer would concede to other parents, "but she's just so withdrawn. When I try to discuss Tyler's reading progress, she gives me these one-word answers and changes the subject. And have you noticed she never joins us for any social events? It's like she doesn't want to be part of our community." Other parents contributed their own observations to the growing narrative. Maria didn't share personal details about her life. She deflected questions about her background with polite but firm boundaries. She seemed uncomfortable when parents tried to engage her in the kind of casual conversations that built relationships within the school community. "My daughter loves her," admitted Rebecca Torres, mother of 5-year-old Sophie. "But I wonder if she's really the right fit for children who need more dynamic instruction." Sophie comes home talking about Miss Maria like she's some kind of superhero. But when I observe during volunteer time, I just see someone who seems scared of her own shadow. These conversations took place within earshot of Maria's classroom. And while she never responded directly to the criticism, those who watched carefully might have noticed how her jaw tightened slightly, how her movements became more controlled, how she seemed to withdraw even further into the protective shell she had constructed around her new life. The truth was that Maria Santos heard every word, understood every implication, and carried the weight of knowing that her careful attempts to blend into this safe, suburban world were failing. But the alternative, revealing who she really was and what she had done before arriving at Sunshine Kindergarten, seemed infinitely more dangerous than enduring the disapproval of parents who couldn't possibly understand the depth of her qualifications to protect their children. What these parents didn't know was that Maria Santos wasn't actually her real name. The woman they dismissed as overly quiet and socially awkward was Maria Elena Vasquez, former staff sergeant in the United States Army Special Forces, veteran of 3 combat deployments, and holder of 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart that would never be displayed in any classroom. She had spent 8 years as a Special Forces medic, serving in places that didn't appear on civilian maps, treating wounds that resulted from conflicts that were never reported in newspapers. She had crawled through minefields to reach wounded soldiers, performed emergency surgery in the back of moving vehicles under enemy fire, and made life-and-death decisions in situations where the wrong choice meant losing people she had sworn to protect. The quiet competence that parents interpreted as social anxiety was actually the controlled demeanor of someone trained to function under extreme pressure. The organizational systems they found excessive were the habits of someone whose attention to detail had meant the difference between life and death for dozens of soldiers who trusted her with their lives. But Maria had left that world behind for reasons that still visited her in nightmares, and she had chosen early childhood education specifically because it represented everything that her military life had not. Peace, innocence, the opportunity to nurture growth instead of treating trauma, the chance to be surrounded by laughter instead of screams. The transition hadn't been easy. Civilian life required social skills she had never fully developed, demanded vulnerability she had been trained to suppress, and expected the kind of casual interactions that felt foreign to someone whose conversations had once been limited to mission briefings and medical emergencies. So Maria had created the persona of the quiet kindergarten teacher, someone unremarkable enough to avoid scrutiny, competent enough to do good work, and reserved enough to maintain the boundaries that kept her 2 worlds separate. For 3 years, the strategy had worked perfectly, until the morning when everything changed. It started like any other Tuesday. Maria arrived at her usual time, prepared the classroom with her typical precision, and greeted the arriving children with the same gentle warmth that had made her beloved among the students, even as it puzzled their parents. The morning activities proceeded normally. Circle time, phonics practice, art projects that covered small hands with washable paint and filled the room with concentrated creativity. But at 10:47 a.m. during outdoor playtime, 5-year-old Marcus Chen attempted to climb the tall slide from the wrong side, lost his grip, and fell 8 feet onto the concrete surface below. The sound of the impact carried across the playground like a gunshot, causing every adult within hearing range to turn toward the source. Marcus lay motionless beside the slide structure, blood beginning to pool beneath his head where it had struck the concrete. The playground supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, began moving toward the injured child while reaching for the radio that would summon emergency medical assistance. But Maria was already running. What the other teachers and parent volunteers witnessed in the next few minutes would fundamentally alter their understanding of the quiet woman they thought they knew. Maria reached Marcus before anyone else, dropping to her knees beside the unconscious child with a fluidity of movement that spoke of experience far beyond typical first aid training. Her hands moved with surgical precision as she assessed his condition, checking pulse and breathing with the kind of systematic thoroughness that revealed extensive medical knowledge. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that none of them had ever heard before, issuing instructions with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to taking command in crisis situations. She directed Mrs. Patterson to clear the area of other children while maintaining visual contact with Marcus. She instructed the nearest parent volunteer to retrieve specific medical supplies from the school office, listing items by their technical names rather than the simplified terminology typically used in elementary school settings. She positioned herself to protect Marcus's airway while simultaneously monitoring his vital signs and watching for symptoms that could indicate life-threatening complications. But it was what she did next that revealed the true depth of her hidden expertise. When Marcus began showing signs of increased intracranial pressure, symptoms that most people wouldn't recognize, let alone know how to treat, Maria's response was immediate and decisive. Using techniques that belonged in an emergency room rather than a kindergarten playground, she stabilized his condition while providing the kind of expert care that paramedics would later describe as textbook perfect trauma response. Her movements were economical and precise, her decision-making flawless, her ability to remain calm under pressure absolutely professional. The paramedics arrived 7 minutes after the initial call, expecting to find a typical school accident requiring standard emergency protocols. Instead, they found a scene that had been managed with the kind of competence they rarely encountered outside of military or emergency medical settings. Who provided initial treatment? The lead paramedic asked as his team took over Marcus's care. Miss Maria did, Mrs. Patterson replied, pointing to the kindergarten teacher who was now standing several feet away, her hands still stained with Marcus's blood, her expression unreadable. The paramedic looked from Marcus, whose condition had been stabilized with expert care, to the quiet woman in the cheerful kindergarten teacher outfit, and something in her posture made him pause. When he asked if she was a nurse, Maria's response was carefully neutral, but those watching closely might have noticed the slight hesitation before she told him she had some medical training. The paramedic nodded, apparently satisfied, but his experienced eye had caught details that others missed. The way she had positioned herself during treatment, the terminology she had used when describing Marcus's condition, the confidence with which she had made decisions that required significant medical expertise. As the ambulance departed with Marcus and his mother, who had arrived pale with terror but grateful beyond words for Maria's intervention, the playground returned to its normal activities. But the adults who had witnessed the incident found themselves looking at Maria Santos with new eyes. The transformation had been too complete, too professional, too confident to be explained by basic first aid certification or casual medical knowledge. The woman who claimed to be shy and socially awkward had just demonstrated leadership abilities and medical expertise that suggested a background far more complex than anyone had imagined. Jennifer Walsh, who had been present during the emergency, found herself replaying the scene with growing curiosity. The teacher she had dismissed as withdrawn and antisocial had taken command of the situation with the kind of natural authority that couldn't be taught in education courses. When Jennifer asked Rebecca Torres if she had seen how Maria handled the emergency, Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. She mentioned that Sophie had once told her that Miss Maria has scars on her hands, and when she was helping Marcus, Rebecca had noticed them clearly. They looked like surgery scars or something similar, she observed with growing curiosity. The questions that followed Maria through the rest of that week were polite but persistent. Parents who had previously shown little interest in her background suddenly wanted to know about her education, her previous experience, her training in emergency medical procedures. Maria deflected each inquiry with the same careful politeness she had always used, but the intensity of the scrutiny was different now. Instead of being dismissed as socially awkward, she was being studied as someone who might be deliberately concealing important information about herself. The truth was that Maria's response to Marcus's injury had triggered muscle memory she had spent 3 years trying to suppress. The moment she saw the child lying motionless on the concrete, she had stopped being a kindergarten teacher and reverted to being Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez, Special Forces medic, trained to stabilize trauma victims under combat conditions. Everything she had done, from her initial assessment to her treatment decisions to the way she had managed the scene, came from 8 years of experience treating wounded soldiers in situations where hesitation meant death and mistakes were measured in lives lost. But admitting that would require explanations she wasn't prepared to give would open doors to a past she had worked hard to close, and would potentially expose the children in her care to scrutiny that could compromise the safety she had tried so hard to build. So Maria continued to deflect, to maintain her boundaries, and to hope that the increased attention would fade as memories of the incident grew less immediate. She underestimated the persistence of parents who had discovered that their assumptions about her were wrong, and who were determined to understand what they had really witnessed. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Amanda Chen, Marcus's mother and a pediatric surgeon at Phoenix Children's Hospital, had spent considerable time thinking about the medical care her son had received before the paramedics arrived. As a physician, she understood exactly how sophisticated Maria's treatment had been, how many critical decisions had been made correctly, and how unlikely it was for someone without extensive medical training to possess that level of expertise. When Marcus returned to school 2 weeks later, fully recovered but sporting an impressive scar that made him a temporary celebrity among his classmates, Dr. Chen requested a private meeting with Maria to express her gratitude. What she intended as a simple thank you conversation became something much more significant when she began asking specific questions about Maria's medical background and received answers that revealed far more than the kindergarten teacher had intended to share. "You use terminology that most nurses wouldn't know," Dr. Chen observed carefully. "When you describe Marcus's pupil response to the paramedics, you mention Glasgow Coma Scale indicators. That's not typical first aid knowledge." Maria realized she had made a mistake, had allowed her professional training to override her civilian camouflage, and now faced a choice between telling the truth or maintaining a deception that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Dr. Chen, sensing Maria's discomfort but also recognizing the profound skill that had potentially saved her son's life, pressed gently for more information. "I'm not asking to satisfy curiosity. I'm asking because I'm a doctor, and I know expertise when I see it. You didn't just help Marcus. You provided the kind of trauma care that probably prevented serious complications or worse." The weight of 3 years of careful concealment suddenly seemed unbearable. Maria found herself facing a woman whose child she had helped save, whose professional knowledge made deception impossible, and whose obvious gratitude suggested that the truth might be received with understanding rather than judgment. What followed was a conversation that began with careful admissions and gradually evolved into the first honest discussion Maria had had about her background since arriving at Sunshine Kindergarten. Dr. Chen listened without interruption as Maria explained her military service, her medical training, her reasons for leaving that life behind, and her choice to work with children as a way of healing from experiences that had left her with nightmares and hypervigilance that made normal social interactions feel impossible. When Maria finished, Dr. Chen quietly told her that she had saved her son's life. But more than that, she had been taking care of all these children with skills that most people couldn't imagine. Dr. Chen asked why she was hiding this extraordinary background. Maria's answer revealed the complexity of her situation, the difficulty of explaining military service to civilian parents, the challenge of discussing combat experience in a kindergarten setting, and the fear that revealing her background would somehow compromise the safe environment she had tried to create for herself and the children in her care. But Dr. Chen's response surprised her. Instead of concern or confusion, she expressed admiration for Maria's service and gratitude for the level of protection and expertise she brought to her classroom. More importantly, Dr. Chen offered to help Maria navigate the questions and attention that had intensified since Marcus's accident. When Dr. Chen suggested that these parents didn't need to know everything, but they deserved to know that their children were in the care of someone with extraordinary qualifications to keep them safe, Maria felt a weight beginning to lift from her shoulders. What followed was a carefully managed revelation that transformed Maria's relationship with the Sunshine Kindergarten community without compromising her privacy or security. Dr. Chen, speaking as both a grateful parent and a medical professional, shared enough information about Maria's background to address parents' questions while respecting her need for discretion about specific details. The parents learned that their quiet kindergarten teacher was a military veteran with extensive medical training, that her reserved demeanor reflected the discipline and focus she had developed during years of service, and that her expertise in emergency situations far exceeded anything they could have hoped for in a civilian teacher. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Parents who had criticized Maria's social awkwardness now understood it as the natural reserve of someone transitioning from military to civilian life. Her organizational systems were recontextualized as evidence of professional competence rather than excessive rigidity. Her protective instincts with the children were recognized as the heightened awareness of someone trained to anticipate and prevent danger. Jennifer Walsh, who had led the informal campaign to question Maria's suitability as a teacher, became one of her strongest advocates. "We were judging her for not being like us," she admitted to other parents. "We didn't realize she wasn't like us because she's better qualified than any of us to take care of our children." The transformation in the classroom dynamics was immediate and profound. Parents who had previously kept polite distance began seeking Maria's advice on child safety and emergency preparedness. They invited her to social events with genuine enthusiasm rather than obligatory politeness. They began to see her quiet strength as an asset rather than a limitation. But perhaps more importantly, Maria began to see herself differently. The acceptance and appreciation of the parents allowed her to integrate aspects of her military identity with her civilian role in ways that strengthened both. She developed safety programs for the school that drew on her tactical training. She created emergency preparedness protocols that reflected her understanding of crisis management. She began sharing stories with the children about courage and service that drew from her own experiences without revealing details inappropriate for their age. The children, who had always sensed something special about Miss Maria, now understood why they felt so safe in her presence. She wasn't just their teacher, she was their protector, someone who possessed the skills and experience to keep them secure in ways they couldn't articulate but instinctively trusted. 6 months after Marcus's accident, Maria Santos had become one of the most respected and beloved teachers at Sunshine Kindergarten. Parents requested placement in her classroom specifically because they knew their children would receive not just quality education, but also protection from someone uniquely qualified to provide both. The annual Teacher Appreciation Ceremony that year included a special recognition for Maria's service, both military and educational. As she stood before an audience of parents, colleagues, and children, who had come to understand her true worth, Maria realized that she had finally found a way to honor both aspects of her identity. Dr. Chen, who had become a close friend and advocate, introduced Maria by acknowledging the unique combination of strength and gentleness that made her such an effective teacher. She brings to our children's education the discipline she learned in service to our country, the medical expertise she developed caring for wounded soldiers, and the compassion she discovered in her own journey from warrior to educator. The applause that followed was longer and more enthusiastic than Maria had ever received, but what moved her most was the sight of her students in the front row, clapping with the enthusiastic appreciation of children who had always known their teacher was special, even when the adults around them had been too distracted by their own assumptions to see it. As the ceremony concluded and parents approached to express their gratitude and respect, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her from the battlefields of Afghanistan to the bright, safe classroom where she now spent her days. The transition hadn't been easy, and the integration of her two identities had required courage she hadn't known she possessed. But standing surrounded by children who trusted her completely and parents who valued her contributions, Maria understood that she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. A way to continue serving that honored her past while building a future filled with hope instead of trauma, growth instead of survival, and laughter instead of tears. The kindergarten teacher they had initially underestimated had become the guardian they never knew they needed, proving that the most extraordinary protectors often hide behind the most ordinary appearances, and that the transition from warrior to educator doesn't require abandoning strength. It requires channeling it toward nurturing the next generation. Marcus Chen, now fully recovered and thriving in first grade, still visits Miss Maria's classroom whenever he can. When asked about the day he fell, he tells people with 5-year-old certainty that Miss Maria saved his life. He's right, but not just in the way he means. By forcing her to reveal her true capabilities, his accident had saved Maria's life too, allowing her to finally become whole by integrating the soldier she had been with the teacher she had chosen to become. So I ask you, have you ever underestimated someone based on their quiet demeanor, only to discover they possessed extraordinary strength and capabilities? Have you known teachers, caregivers, or other seemingly ordinary people who turned out to have remarkable backgrounds? Share your stories in the comments. Tell us about the hidden heroes in your community, the unexpected protectors who keep us safe without seeking recognition. Because at Inspiring Stories, we believe that the most powerful people are often the quietest ones, and that the transition from warrior to nurturer doesn't diminish strength. It transforms it into something even more precious, the power to shape and protect the future. Thank you for watching. If this story inspired you, subscribe and help us celebrate the extraordinary women who hide their remarkable past behind ordinary titles. We share new stories of hidden strength every day, proving that heroes come in all forms and work in all professions. And remember, the next time you meet someone who seems too quiet, too reserved, or too humble about their abilities, look closer. You might be standing next to someone who has saved lives, served their country, or overcome challenges you couldn't imagine. The kindergarten teacher cleaning paint off small hands might once have sutured wounds under enemy fire. The librarian organizing books might have organized rescue operations. The woman you dismiss as ordinary might be extraordinary in ways you'll never fully understand. These stories matter because they remind us that strength takes many forms, that service continues long after uniforms are put away, and that the people who protect our children often carry invisible medals earned in places we'll never see.